Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I am fully recovered now. Last night I was a bit tired, but I'm back on form again today. If you're new to the channel, if you new people found me over the week when I was at the We Have Ways Fest, welcome aboard. All the information you always will need is in the description below. Links to the merchandise, links to my guests' websites if they have them, their books, etc., etc. But here we are. So from China to the USA and back again, World War II TV Brigadier on Patron, Susan Yu, is joined to talk about her father's amazing life and service. And so before I bring Susan in, this is the kind of thing you can do, folks. If you're a regular viewer of World War II TV and you have a story to tell, just come and do it. Don't be nervous. I'm not going to bite, not much, and it'll be fun. So I'm going to bring Susan in now, and Susan's toured Normandy with me. Good afternoon, Susan. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good. So it's been a long time coming. We've kind of talked about this on and off, certainly months, if not even into kind of years now. And here you are. So we're going to bring up the PowerPoint and kind of get straight underway. And folks, we'll probably do the big questions at the end of the show today. And but there'll be little opportunities during the presentation for me to jump in with things. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Susan to take us through this show, and we'll all sit and learn. So over to you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Woody. My dad, Quin Shen Yu, came to the U.S. in 1929 from a small Chinese village when he was 13. He was accepted by a small steel town in western Pennsylvania where he thrived. Dad returned to China to help in the war effort during World War II. Surviving life-threatening episodes in China, he came back to the U.S. with a new wife to complete his education, work in the steel industry, and raise a family. To me, he was always the man of steel. I'd like to share his story with you, and this story is based on his autobiography. One thing before I start, I'm ethnic Chinese, but I don't speak fluent Chinese. I did grow up in a household where we spoke some Toisan dialect, some Cantonese, and some Mandarin. So the words are in my head, and I can sometimes spit out a sentence or two. My pronunciations of places will either be in Toisan, Cantonese, Mandarin, or some kind of hybrid. This is a list of discrimination laws against the Chinese and the Asians. These were the early years. And the first 5 were discrimination laws specifically targeting the Chinese. Dad came from a village called Lobaksan, which means Old White Hill. And that was in Huaisanyan, which is Toisan County, and that was in Guangdong Province, Guangunsan. Names change all the time, and now Lobaksan is known as Nam'an. And there's Lobaksan on an old army map that somebody found for me. This little village had about 30 families. There were dirt floors, no electricity, no running water. People farmed for a living. Dad gives a loving description of growing up here. He talks about life that was easygoing. However, when there were crop failures, people starved to death. And because of this cycle, men from this area found a way to support their families. Generations of men went to the United States. They panned for gold, helped build the railroads, worked in laundries, restaurants, and did odd jobs to send money back to their families. Most lived in poverty. They could not bring their wives and families because of the Chinese exclusion laws. My great-grandfather, Chongqing, came to the U.S. sometime in the 1870s to work on the Northern Pacific Railroad. He spent most of his life away from his family and got back to Lobaksan for a few years before he died. My grandfather, Hong Panyi, swam across the Rio Grande River from Mexico to get to the U.S. around 1905. Because of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, records were lost, and my grandfather was able to obtain papers showing he was born in the U.S. He ran a small one-room laundry in Duquesne, Pennsylvania, a small steel town on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, with his older brother. He traveled back and forth from China at least twice, including this trip on the SS Mongolia. My grandfather died at the age of 54 in 1934 in Duquesne, never to see his family in China again. And these are some of the immigration papers that I found at NARA at San Bruno, California. My dad came to the U.S. when he was 13 with his father. He was born February 21st, 1916, conceived during my grandfather's 1915 trip to China. My dad met his own father when he was about 10, when my grandfather came home for about a year in 1928. When it was time for my grandfather to go back to Pittsburgh, he took my dad. Dad talked about how my grandmother held him all night and cried about him leaving. My father would never see his mother again. And my grandfather would never see his wife again. Dad said she died of malnutrition in 1946. My dad and grandfather took the SS President Madison from Hong Kong December 18, 1928, and arrived in San Francisco January 9, 1929. They arrived and were processed through the Angel Island Immigration Processing and Detention Center. They then took a train from San Francisco to Pittsburgh. And there's the ship's log and some of my dad's immigration papers.
Just a quick question for you, Susan.
Sure.
When I think of kind of immigration to the USA, kind of late 19th century, earlier 20th century, I think of all the amazing records there are, for example, Irish people going over to the USA, and I think of people going from Europe. When you were looking into this from beyond your father's own life, is it something that's generally well recorded? Are there hundreds of autobiographies by Chinese people who emigrated to the USA, or is your father's voice one of the few in this area?
I think he's pretty unique in this area because he had been writing his autobiography for years, and I think I haven't seen that many that are out there that tell this kind of story in this kind of detail, and there aren't that many people that went back to China, as a civilian.
Right. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. My grandfather, his brother, and dad lived and worked in the same 14 by 14 foot room where they ran their laundry, heating hot water, adding it to the washer, rinsing, drying, ironing, eating here, and sleeping here. Dad was supposed to help, but there was little work. There were about 200 small laundries in the Pittsburgh area, and because of discrimination, laundries and restaurants were the only jobs that the Chinese could get. Dad spent his teen years in Duquesne. He started in second grade since he didn't know a word of English. He was a fast learner and went on to 8th grade in a few years. He graduated from Duquesne High School in 1936, third in his class. Dad adapted to his new world, and he became the head of the safety patrols. He became a Boy Scout. He played football and was a halfback. He said one day he made a big play, and the next day the paper had a picture of him saying, "Chinese football star makes go-ahead touchdown." There's his diploma. And he became lifelong friends with neighbors, teachers, and classmates. When he graduated, he was hired by U.S. Steel Duquesne Works. His job was working in a chipping yard where defects on semi-finished casting products, called blooms and billets, were removed by an air chipping hammer. He said that there were a few hundred people assigned to this job, all housed in one noisy building. I found it quite remarkable that this small Pennsylvania town took Dad under their wing and accepted him as one of their own. I'm sure he faced some hate and racism, but he never talked about it. After working in the mills, Dad decided to go to college and become an engineer. He wanted to be able to bring back technical skills to China. He used his savings to enroll in Carnegie Institute of Technology in 1937. And he even got a letter from the president of U.S. Steel, the Carnegie Illinois Steel Corporation. And we had this letter at home. It's signed by the president, Benjamin Franklin Fairless. Unfortunately, after 2 semesters, he ran out of money. Meanwhile, The Japanese invaded Manchuria on the northern border of China in 1931. There were incidents where Japan encroached further into China, and the Japanese fully invaded China in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. I perused some of the papers of that time, just trying to imagine what Dad was reading and what the news was like. I found a lot of interesting articles, and in this case, there's an article about bombing of thousands and thousands of people in Guangzhou, and on the right, there's an article about a Chinese and Japanese person politely debating whether Chinese should be under Japan, since they're both Asian countries, and then lots of pleas for relief and for help to China. A lot of people going to garden clubs and women's clubs, and this particular man who was the head of the China Institute going to Carnegie Hall. In my dad's papers, I found postcards and flyers with meetings taking place in Pittsburgh regarding how to help the Chinese effort. In 1939, Dad heard about a program where the China Institute was recruiting Chinese student volunteers to train as mechanics for maintenance trucks on the Burma Road. China Institute is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution, and it's still active in New York City. China Institute was able to obtain aid with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt and Lachlan Curry, at that time an economist with the Federal Reserve. Under the mechanics program, Chinese Americans who spoke Chinese were recruited. Dad and his friends spent 6 months in Detroit at Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford. Dad learned how to repair trucks and received certificates from each company. They stayed at the YMCA. An article in the Detroit Free Press dated June 20th, 1939, 30 young men sent by China to study cars, gives a description of the program. I contacted China Institute to see if they had any documents about this program, and they said that they had donated all their documents to the CV Starr East Asian Library, part of Columbia University in New York. And when I called CV Starr, they said that they were cataloging the documents and they would be available in September of 2024 to look at if I wanted. And here's one of my dad's certificates from Chrysler. Dad obtained a Chinese passport with dual citizenships, Chinese and US, which would allow him to travel through French Indochina, now Vietnam, to China, with all the necessary travel protection allotted to all Americans. In January 1940, my dad and his friends boarded the oil tanker, the SS Panama City in New York, and they were on their way to China. The first stop was Savannah, Georgia, and then they headed to China via the Panama Canal. On their voyage, they stopped in Honolulu, Manila, Cebu Island, and Haiphong. Most stopovers were about a week or so the Panama City could discharge its cargo, refuel, and get supplies. He and his friends did sightseeing like regular tourists. He wrote the captain of the tanker, Captain Holliday, was a kind older gentleman who treated them well. They played checkers and pitch quakes with the captain and dined with him almost every night. The radio operator was named Spark because he was always full of life. And the first mate and engineer were kind. And there was a Filipino who worked in the mess hall that liked to play the banjo and sing. On their last night together in Haiphong, Captain Holliday took them to a dinner nightclub where they danced all night and had a wonderful time. Not quite sure how long the voyage on the Panama City took, but according to the narrative, it was maybe about 2 months or a little over 2 months.
Wow. And just a quick question for you again, Susan. You emphasized the newspapers, American newspapers, about aid to China and presenting, China's plight with Japan and what have you. But is there anything in your father's memoirs or in your research about the American interest in having people from the US to see what's going on in China? The humanitarian angle is, of course, one and an important one, but it's also worth noting that at this point, the US, like many other the Western allies, they're wanting observers in these places where war is happening. The USA is not yet at war themselves there. So did you think your father was given any kind of briefing, or the men he was with, on how they were to represent the US, or things they were to be looking for, or any kind of advice to be there in terms of, I'm not going to say the word spies, but to gain information?
He doesn't write about that, and he really had not talked about it. But there were always missionaries there in China, and there were people like General Chenault that went over, before the actual war started. So there are a lot of people that did go and help. But specifically with my dad, I'm sure he and his friends must have talked about it among themselves. I don't know if they actually got any instructions, maybe from the China Institute. Maybe I'll find that out later.
Yeah, no, it's just the way my brain works. It's just that always things connecting and having, like the Lend-Lease issue. Often people perceive it, I know this is a separate subject and it's a typical Woody rabbit hole, but people perceive it as the US helping other countries. But of course, the other countries were also benefiting from Lend-Lease going the other way. So some of these missions like this, they have an obvious mission of the US assisting China, but there's always this kind of China information from China can also go back to the USA that'll help in their kind of plan. That's just the way my brain works. So forgive me for that. But off to a cracking start, by the way. People are loving it, Susan. So keep on going. We're all behind you.
Okay, thank you. He and his friends took the train from Haiphong to Hanoi, ending in Lao Cai, which is French Indochina, where the railroad ended. From Lao Cai on the China border, they took a 3-day ride on an old broken-down bus to Kunming, and you can follow along on the map here. This particular paper was from Ontario, Canada, for my Canadian friends. And then from Kunming, they took a bus for about 300 miles to Guiyang, and then another 300 miles that took 2 weeks to the city of Chongqing, where they were to report. So back then, in the Americanized version, it was Chongqing. The roads were in terrible shape, and the buses constantly broke down. When they arrived in Chongqing, it was the temporary capital of Free China. The city was built on a steep hill overlooking the Yangtze, or the Chuangjiang River. The river currents were wild and rapid. The bus arrived on the south bank of the Chuangjiang, and you'd have to take a ferry or a sampan to get to the city. After going across the river to the docks, you'd have to climb 1,000 steps to reach the first streets of the city. Chongqing was one of the prime areas for Japanese bombing to break the Chinese will. Dad wrote about 50% of the buildings and all the power stations were destroyed, with 100 bombers bombing the city every day. I found this in the Los Angeles Times from 1940. There's a map of the Burma Road, Generalissimo Chang and his wife, and the top enlarged picture is a picture of the city of Chongqing from back then. And then bottom right is some bombed out parts of the neighborhood. They reported to the China Transport Corporation, Dad and his friends. CTC was formed under a special charter granted by the national government, established in Chongqing, January 1st, 1940. Formation of the CTC was based on the U.S. system with recommendations by the American Highway Mission, who were highway experts. CTC ran the centralized control operation of civil highway transport services, passengers as well as freight. This included bus and transportation facilities for all of Free China. Although they had work assignments with CTC, Dad wrote that they hardly ever got any work done because of the bombing of Chongqing. Every day they had to run for cover. They'd have to run down the 1,000 steps, get on a ferry, get across the Chongqing River, and then take a truck and drive 15 miles into the countryside. They normally stayed on top of a hill and played bridge until the air raids were over. He wrote one day they decided to change locations where they played, and on that same day, the regular location was bombed. He felt really lucky. After the air raids, they went back to the city the same way that they came. They'd have some dinner, and the next day would be the same. After a few months, Dad got his first assignment in Dushan. Dushan is about 100 miles southeast of Huiyang and south and east of where the Burma Road runs. Dushan was a bus and truck maintenance station. Dad said the manager and his crew were all from Hunan, where they ate very hot, spicy food. They used ground red pepper with oil and mixed it with their rice, which made their lips turn red after every meal. When Dad was there, he made constructive suggestions regarding modern techniques in truck maintenance, but they were never used. Dad wrote he didn't want to press the manager over the changes so as not to hurt his feelings. I found very few references to Dushan during this time period. The movie The Mountain Road, starring Jimmy Stewart and released in 1960, is about an officer assigned to blow up an ammo dump in Dushan. Apparently, the movie was not very popular because it was considered an anti-war movie, and it's on YouTube. After a couple months, Dad was assigned as the manager of the Wanding maintenance station on the China-Burma border. Dad said his group from the U.S. controlled all the maintenance stations in a large area from Chongqing to Wanding. And I found this great map from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. In the upper left, you can see there's a key and the symbol, which says key maintenance stations run days apart, a days run apart, directed by American experts. And so if you look at Wanding, that's where my dad was. And right above where Wanding is, it says bad malarial district. And also in this particular newspaper article, it showed the elevation that people had to travel over, the hump. And then that other map shows the railroad lines, connecting roads where the Japanese were, the Burma Road. And what I found was pretty amazing that the newspapers during this time period were doing a stellar job at making maps, presenting information to people. Some of the maps were distributed by AP and went to a bunch of different newspapers. And some people had their own people draw the maps and draw the pictures. And so this was great because, there was no television back there. There was only radio, and you can't really picture a map over description of a radio. So I thought this was newspapers back then were really doing a great job.
And I'm really glad you're mentioning that, Susan, because I think we have a perception that the USA don't hear anything about World War II, certainly in the Southern Hemisphere, until December 1941. And the reality is, we've talked about it on other shows, is there's lots of information in American newspapers. The people are very interested. Mike Nyberg has talked about how that there was lots of news coming out of Europe to America, and lots of as you say, information coming out of China. It's somehow in the years that have passed, we've kind of forgotten that. And I have a question for you. You said earlier about your father not writing about experiencing any kind of racism in the USA when he was playing football in the Boy Scouts and what have you. But what about kind of the other way of racism? He is now an American Chinese. So going back to China, do we know whether he was treated differently, or they think of him as, well, you left us once? Do you know anything about that kind of dynamic? Is there a general perception of your dad and his buddies being considered as kind of foreigners themselves, or are they kind of welcomed back to the fold, so to speak?
I imagine they experienced a little bit of both, depending upon who they were talking to and what they were doing. And, the dialects are all different. Some people, spoke Mandarins, Toisan. My dad mostly knew Toisan. I don't think he knew Mandarin back in those days. He knew Cantonese. So it was just a mixed bag. And that happened with the Chinese American units that went back there too.
Yeah.
That, not all of them spoke the same language, essentially. So English.
Yeah. Thank you. Brilliant answer. Thank you.
Okay. I found this drawing of Wanding. Oh, did I say my dad was assigned to Wanding? Yeah. Okay.
You did.
I found this drawing of Wanding accompanying an article written by Leland Stowe, a war correspondent who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1930. He describes how chaotic Wanding was for customs inspection and processing and clearing of papers to cross back and forth from the China-Burma border. Another eyewitness was Mary Edna Salmon, wife of a prominent U.S. businessman, driving with a group of friends from Rangoon to Kunming. And she writes about the emergency crews living by the side of the Burma Road. I'm going to read this for you.
Yep.
She said, "We were amazed at the ingenuity shown by the coolies in repairing a bomb crater in the center of the road, carrying soil and baskets, mixing concrete with their bare legs, and accomplishing backbreaking road work with only crude tools. Today, many among the reserves of coolies who live along the side of the road as emergency crews are Chinese women. They work with their babies strapped to their backs. No wonder 4 years of the war has not phased China, although she was unbelievably unprepared." She really writes a great article when you read it. The maintenance area had 6 bays, each equipped with a workbench and vise. The tools were inadequate, according to Dad. There were only a few hydraulic and mechanical jacks, some hand tools. Each bay had a pit where trucks could be inspected and minor repairs were performed underneath. There was no electricity or running water. They used kerosene lanterns for light at night, and water had to be carried from the creek with buckets and placed in a storage tank. Each truck was put on a maintenance schedule, such as oil change the transmission, patching radiator leaks, and also renewing brake linings, repairing cooling systems, all the gamut of car repair they did. Dad wrote that the truck drivers were a wild bunch from China, South Asia, Burma, and India. They drove in neutral down steep hairpin curves with excess braking to save fuel, and then sold the gasoline in Kunming. Then they pocketed the money. Each trip, the brake lining had to be replaced, and the drums remained distorted due to excess heat that was generated. And some trucks ended up not having any brakes at all and plunged into deep ravines. For personnel, he had 1 engineer, 1 clerk, 1 accountant, 1 secretary, 1 cook with 2 helpers, 3 laborers, and 8 mechanics from different parts of China and Burma. Dad said he was lucky to have a secretary who was a displaced Chinese from Burma who spoke Toisan and took care of the correspondence and reports in Chinese to be sent to Chongqing. Spare parts were hard to get, and the working area was not paved. It became very muddy after the rain, and personnel sometimes contracted malaria, and lack of medical supplies made it very difficult to perform a good job. Despite the handicaps, Dad mentioned that they kept the trucks rolling. After several months at Wanding, Dad transferred to the CTC terminal station in Lashio, Burma, or Myanmar. He did similar work which he had performed in Wanding. Living conditions in Lashio were a lot better, with running water and electricity. The buildings were constructed of wood frames with galvanized roofs. The maintenance station was located 5 miles out of Lashio, and they maintained a fleet of trucks running between Lashio and Wanding. The roads were good, level and straight, and broken down trucks were less frequent. Spare parts were easier to get with electricity, and they were able to use power tools, which made maintenance work easier. So a lot of these little pictures that I'm showing you, they were in a small suitcase in my parents' bedroom in their closet. And when I was a little kid, I used to go and look at them. I call them the tiny pictures because they're 2 1/4 by 1.5 inches. Then after I grew up, I never saw them again and occasionally wondered where they were, but didn't ask. My sister found them under my mom's bed after she passed away in 2014. And my dad left us in 2003. So now we have no idea of many of the places these were and many of the people that were in the pictures. The good thing was when they were scanned, the tiny pictures, when enlarged, mostly maintained their quality and visibility. Dad's secretary from Wanding invited him to meet friends visiting Lashio from Rangoon. They mentioned that there were 3 Chinese ladies from Rangoon on vacation and wanted to introduce Dad. According to my dad, one lady was love at first sight, and for him anyway, and it was my mom, Helen. After vacation in Lashio, Helen went back to Rangoon. They kept up a correspondence for a few months, and Dad took a train to Rangoon to meet Mom's family. Before the Japanese invaded Guangzhou or Canton in October 1938, Mom and her family had already fled to Rangoon. Mom graduated from the Canton College of Arts, where she learned Chinese painting from Wang Junbi, considered the Picasso of Chinese watercolor. She had exhibits in Guangzhou and Rangoon. I remember Mom saying she had many suitors and she was not sure that she should choose Dad, and he was distraught that their relationship was in doubt. Dad skips that part in his autobiography and wrote that they thought about getting married soon and not waiting to the end of the war.
Difference in sources there. Welcome to the job of a historian, Susan. two contemporary accounts there. Which one's the accurate one? I always say, always go with a woman in that case.
In the top middle picture, I think that's the first time that they met, because they're the three Chinese ladies, and there's two of Dad's friends. And in the bottom middle picture, I believe that's in Rangoon, because I recognize some of Mom's friends. And I this picture cracks me up. I love this picture because if you look at my picture, at my dad, he's on the far right. He's got a cigarette in his hand, and that look on his face. There's that term called thunderbolt, like he's been hit by a thunderbolt. And, he's met somebody that he's fallen in love with, and can't think of anything else. And then there's my mom on the far left, looking quite serene and calm. So, but of course, I don't have a chance to ask them about these pictures now. The Japanese invaded Myanmar and took over Rangoon March 9, 1942. Most Chinese who left after the Japanese invasion and sought refuge in Rangoon had to flee Rangoon, and some went to Lashio, including Mom and some of her friends. Mom got a job with the China-Burma Railway Corporation. CTC terminated the Lashio maintenance station, and Dad lost his job. He also got a job with the China-Burma Railway Corporation. He wrote the project was really somebody's bad dream, for under even normal conditions, it would take several years to complete a rail line that was approximately 1,000 miles long through rough terrain. One day he inspected the starting point at Kun Long, located about 150 miles from Lashio, a small town on China side of the Salween River, and now it's part of Myanmar. He found a few dozen workers. Half of them were sick with some kind of jungle illness. That's what he called it. He was told that several hundred workers died only after 2 days of being sick. Most of the workers had quit and left. Mom and Dad shared a house in Lashio with friends. On April 24th, 1942, a Japanese army column was spotted about 24 miles from Lashio, coming from Thailand. People scrambled to leave Lashio. Mom and Dad and friends packed their belongings and left Lashio in an Austin with 2 trucks loaded with gasoline following. The situation was confusing, with cars and trucks clogging the highways to China and northern Burma. Vehicles broke down on the highway and were pushed aside. Dad wrote that roads were mainly straight, but a number had hairpin curves. Dad said his anxiety increased, for they did not know how far the Japanese were behind them and how long the cars would hold out. The Austin overheated and stalled, and they had to abandon it. The trucks were not too reliable either, and Mom and 2 of her friends went on the fleet of trucks belonging to the Bank of China. They separated as Dad took one of the other trucks and crossed the bridge to Baosan. Then the Chinese army destroyed the bridge and to hold the Japanese on the other side of the New River. So Joe and I were looking at maps last night, and I kind of discovered that Baosan is the same as Paosan, and the New River is the same as the Salween River. So I think one of my World War II veteran friends is on, who went on the Burma Road. So when I was reading what he had written, he called it Paoshan, but it kind of didn't hit me till just last night that Baoshan and Paoshan were the same same place. And Wing and his 14th Air Services Group were in Baoshan, March 14th, 1945. So Wing, if you're out there. Dad parked the truck at the Baoshan CTC station at the outskirts of the city and went to look for Mom. And right now, I'm going to read you a couple pages directly from Dad from his autobiography. I walked to the city, which had only 2 main streets, and they were jammed with people looking for places to rest, for something to eat, and a place to clean up after the tiresome ordeal of running from the enemy. I met a friend who asked me to join him at the barber shop. Luckily, I did not go with him, as I later found out that he was killed there. I walked along the narrow street, and suddenly I heard the sound of bombers approaching. I thought to myself, those must be our bombers, but my horse sense kicked in and told me that it wasn't so. When I saw the bombers were partially overhead, I think my adrenaline took control over my actions. I dashed away from the street into an old-fashioned house and automatically hid under a wooden bed. The sound of the bombs were awesome, and they exploded everywhere. The dust was so thick, and the visibility was 0. I got up and felt I was still in one piece, but I was in a daze. 5 minutes later, another wave of bombers struck. I moved around and dove under a mud column to avoid being hit by the bomb shrapnel. I luckily escaped the onslaught, and I called it life-threatening episode number 1. Later, I learned that there were 2 waves of bombers that dropped approximately 40 bombs in each wave. The bombers concentrated on the 2 main streets of the city and massacred thousands of innocent civilians. I ventured out into the streets and found corpses everywhere. I looked for Helen, but she could not be found. I hoped that she and her friends made it to Kunming. The situation was confusing and out of control. I bumped into an old overseas Chinese friend from the US. We congratulated each other on being alive and said that we would live to be 100 after this incident. I walked back to the CTC station feeling very depressed, not being able to find Helen, but I consoled myself that she must be safe. When I got back, my truck was gone. I guess in the confusion created by the bombing, it caused the driver to flee. My friend and associate, Tom Tom, an American-born Chinese from San Francisco, also evacuated with his truck. I was able to hitch a ride with him to Kunming. That night, we stayed with another associate, Chang Tae-sui, who was with our group from the US. Later, I learned that he was killed by the communists when he refused to join them. In the morning, we took off from Baoshan. The truck we were given was a little dilapidated with a small leak on the radiator, so we had to drive very slowly and then stop. One day we stopped at a small village to wait for the engine to cool and add water. I walked around for about an hour trying to find the Bank of China trucks. As I strolled back to the place where the truck was parked, my friend Tom Tom had left without me. It was my guess that since the bombing of Baoshan, a lot of mass hysteria was produced and everyone was for himself, even friends. I decided to walk to the next village and hope to catch up with Tom Tom. The weather was hot and humid. I had heavy, high leather boots, which made walking very uncomfortable. Coming from the opposite direction, a Chinese army truck loaded with 40 armed soldiers stopped and pulled me up onto the truck. One soldier pointed a pistol at my forehead and said I was a Japanese spy. I did not panic, but I was scared and thought to myself, if he pulls that trigger, what a way to die after all that I went through in Baoshan. I talked to the soldiers in a mixture of Mandarin and Cantonese and told them that I was from the US and I was here to help them deliver war materials and equipment from Burma to Kunming. I swore at them intentionally in English, knowing that none of them would understand what I said. Luckily, there was a Cantonese officer on board. He heard what I said, and he immediately told the soldiers to let me go. I gave him my watch for saving my life as a token of my appreciation. I call that life-threatening episode number 2, and I escaped. At the next village, I finally caught up with Tom Tom with the truck, and we settled down for the night in a bamboo hut. So that might address something that you were saying earlier, Woody, about how they were treated. they didn't understand, where this person had come from. So.
Yeah, it's the whole. There's a sidebar conversation going on about the complicated nature of China in World War II and warlords and communists and nationalists and all the other independent factions, and then the language is added to the mix there. And just an amazing story. And I feel I want to break the spell a bit by just telling people a bit about military vehicles of that type, because I know a bit about military vehicles. When you were saying a couple of times, Susan, how they were overheating. That was one of the issues with vehicles back then, that you in convoy, especially going up gradients, which they would have been all the time, you're putting a lot of pressure on the engine. The vehicles are often overloaded and they just get really hot. I remember back in my days, military vehicles, they would just boil up the side of the road. You had to, pull over, wait, get water, fill up the radiator and carry on again. It's something that we don't think of today with modern vehicles, but back then it was a regular occurrence and something that you just had to deal with. It's not a maintenance problem as such. It's just the operating temperatures of those vehicles. So thanks for sharing it. And I'm sorry, folks, for boring you with some military vehicle details, but I thought I would just throw it in there. But back to you, Susan. We are all gripped.
Dad made it to Kunming. He roamed the city, crowded and full of refugees, to look for Mom when he spotted her walking with a friend. And from that point on, they were never separated again. Mom's brother, uncles, aunts, and their families, and her stepmother, with her young son and daughter, all fled to Myitkyina, Myanmar. And when the Japanese captured the town, they were held captive and mistreated. They went back to Rangoon after the war, and their properties and businesses were destroyed. Mom's second uncle and son walked from Burma to Guiyang, and his wife died along the way. They then walked from Guiyang to Guangzhou, or Canton, which was a journey of more than 1,000 miles. Mom's stepmother and young son and daughter did the same journey, but nobody was ever able to locate them after the war, and nobody knows what happened to them. Mom and Dad were out of money and stranded in Kunming, and they wanted to go to Chongqing to find a way to get back to the U.S. Dad made arrangements with his friend Danny to travel to Guiyang, and Danny invited them to stay with him until they found an apartment. Danny hired Dad to work at a trucking station, and Mom was able to get a job with the Bureau of Guiyang Highway Department. So these were some of my dad's personal pictures. I don't, this says some kind of mountain, Jiandong Mountain, and I don't really know what any of these other places are, unfortunately.
It shows you the terrain, though. I mean, if nothing else, it just shows you the nature of that for those people like myself who've never been anywhere near that part of the world. It gives you a visual idea. We may not know the exact location, but it gives us a broad sweeping view. Thank you.
After enjoying a year in Guiyang, they decided to move on. They saved enough money to move to Chongqing. They visited the American consulate and the U.S. Army headquarters, which was a necessary step to get back to the U.S. Sometime later, the American Consul General passed on some good news. Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act on December 17, 1943, and would allow 105 Chinese to immigrate to the U.S. And these pictures are also from my dad's collection too. There's a picture they had several pictures of General Chiang Kai-shek. And this one I was able to match up with pictures online that he was there during United Nations Day, June 14, 1943. Dad took a job with two friends who he had met at Carnegie Institute of Technology, and they wanted to start up a Bessemer converter to make steel in Chongqing. This is an old-fashioned method of making steel, which used compressed air to oxidize impurities on molten iron. The operation was mostly manual and was hot and hard work. Mom got a job with a central news agency in the English department as a typist. And a few months later, Dad started a new job at the Ministry of Transportation, Bureau of Vehicle Affairs. In the spring of 1944, when the Japanese were thought to be approaching Guiyang, people in Chongqing were starting to worry about where they should flee. Dad went to the American consulate and obtained application forms for Mom. They handed in Mom's application along with Dad's passport, and it was approved in about a month. Her quota number was number 32 of 105 people allowed to immigrate to the U.S. in 1944. Mom needed a Chinese passport, which she got through the help of a former professor who worked at the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In 3 weeks, she got her passport and her visa, and Dad got his passport through the American consulate. Then they needed money for travel expenses. They managed to get some money from the Minister of Finance, and they sold everything and bought plane tickets to India. They left Chongqing in December of 1944 on a transport plane to Kunming, and from Kunming they flew over the hump and landed in Chittagong Airport. Chittagong, now Chattogram, Bangladesh. They flew to Calcutta to book passage to the U.S. on the neutral ship, the Gripsholm, which had no specific schedule. From Calcutta, they took a train to New Delhi and then to Bombay. In Bombay, they stayed at the Chansa Hotel while they waited for the Gripsholm to arrive at some unknown time. The hotel consisted of one big bedroom and dining room partitioned off by curtains. One of the families staying there was newscaster Connie Chung's mother and 4 sisters, also waiting for the Gripsholm. Connie's dad was a diplomat at the Chinese embassy in the U.S. waiting for his family. My parents kept in touch with the Chung family over the years, and I had emailed with Connie a few months ago, and she is working on her autobiography, but that sounds very interesting. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong thing. There we go. After a few months, the Gripsholm suddenly appeared. The Gripsholm left Bombay July 5th, 1945, sailed into the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean Sea, then on to the Atlantic Ocean. They stopped in Port Said and Athens. They arrived in New York City August 2nd, 1945. And there's the ship's log, and circled in red is my mother's immigration number 32. They took a bus to Pittsburgh and found a place to live. U.S. Steel took Dad back. The superintendent was so taken by Dad's vision of going back to China one day and building steel mills, he arranged for him to work in every department so he could learn the process. Dad was able to hook up with his old boss, now the superintendent of steel conditioning, to the chief metallurgist, and got a night job so he could go back to school at Carnegie Institute of Technology. He obtained a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering in 1947. So this is the quiz question I was telling people about. What famous artist from Pittsburgh went to school with Dad? I'll give you a few seconds to put that in the chat. He went to school there from 1945 to 1949, and you would recognize his name. You'll recognize his name once I say it. It was Andy Warhol. I can't imagine my dad going to school with Andy. But we asked Dad, I think he knew him sort of, but not really well. And we asked Dad, what was Andy Warhol like? He said he was weird. And Dad never said anything bad about anybody.
I think that would be everybody's go-to statement about Andy Warhol, though, wouldn't it be? He was weird. Whether you think he was talented or not, definitely comes under the weird category. Interesting that the city of Duquesne, which is how I would say, because that's another spelling of Mag's surname, Duquesne. It's all the same French origin surname. So we're bringing it all up and connecting all the dots again today, Susan. It's crazy how these things happen.
I know. Yeah, Mag and I had said something to each other on Facebook too. And see, these are some pictures from the early years in Pittsburgh. At U.S. Steel, he went from draftsman and various jobs to the U.S. Steel headquarters Central Engineering Department, designing continuous steel casting machines for domestic and foreign plants. He also had 8 patents, all relating to steelmaking. After 30 plus years at U.S. Steel, he was hired as a consultant that helped move a steel mill from Austria to China. And now you know why we call him the Man of Steel.
Mm.
And Mom, not to be outdone, taught Chinese painting, opened a jewelry store, and had 2 restaurants in Pittsburgh. And if you look at the bottom right picture, that's my mom shaking hands with President George H.W. Bush. She's telling him something. Mom was pretty outspoken, so I don't know what she was saying to him. Maybe my brothers or my sister might know.
Wow.
And here are some other pictures from later in life. Dad passed away November 3rd, 2003, and Mom passed away June 26, 2014. And I want to thank Dad and Mom for their resilience and persistence. And I want to thank family and friends, Paul, of course, and the World War WW2TV crew, and especially Rick and Brad and Scott and Ivan and Norma, who helped me with the talk. And I wanted to mention my dear friends, Angela and Lorelei, and everybody else that's been so supportive. You know, Paul's really built a great community here. And we learn a lot too. The book was based on my dad's autobiography that was self-published, Quin Shen Yu, A Story of the Yu Clan, China, and Man of Steel. Self-published in 2000, edited by my brothers Alex and Ben. And most of my papers now, my dad's papers, are at the Smithsonian Institute at the Archive Center. I found them in an old milk carton in the garage at their Pittsburgh home, and I immediately took them home. I met Sam Vong, the curator, at an event, and I told him about my dad's pictures. He and an associate came out to the house and looked at the different pictures, and he said that pictures and documents, he said that they would love to have them, so they're there at the Smithsonian now. The Golden Journey with Historical Timeline by Susan Yu, or by Linda Yu, that's my sister, was a interactive CD that she made. And Linda, who's always ahead of her time, made this CD so early in the CD game that it no longer plays on modern computers, but we did record it and put it on YouTube. The newspaper articles I obtained mostly from newspapers.com. And one thing that I learned in this experience, if you Google something and it's not there, if you do a search in the newspapers, you can really find a lot of stuff. So I thought that was kind of a good lesson, that just because you Google something, it's not necessarily, doesn't exist. That my dad's high school, Duquesne High School, had a strike in 1935. They were mad at one of the teachers two of the teachers that were let go. So it's like all these students just, walked out, 1,000 students from that little high school in a small town in Pittsburgh. Nothing on Google, but a week's worth of articles in the newspapers. So that makes you think about what we're missing. And I also got documents from NARA, San Bruno, and online. So thank you very much for letting me tell my dad's story.
Well, thank you very much for sharing it with us. And folks, this is, again, I remind you that you can do this. If you're watching this now and you have a presentation, get in touch. Even if you don't have a presentation, but have an idea, get in touch anyway, and we'll work on it together. So we have a few questions for you, Susan, which you hopefully can answer or not. Peter O'Connell asked much earlier on, the Burma Road trucks, were they operated by civilian tractors, the KMT Army, or a mixture? Do you happen to know the answer?
I think it was mixed. There were and what I was reading from Leland Stowe and Mary Edna Salmon and other people, their accounts, it was all different kinds of people. And they murdered, according to Mary Edna, they murdered each other for the supplies that they were carrying on the Burma Road.
Wow.
That's a whole other story that Leland Stowe writes about, the corruption that was going on, that some of the supplies didn't get to where they were supposed to be going because people were selling it before it got there. So that's another story.
Yeah, it's a massive, great rabbit hole there. And just representing the lots of comments we had in the sidebar. Sheldrake, for example, great to see Susan graduate from the sidebar crew to become a presenter. Congrats. You mentioned Burma. Well, you mentioned Burma and what is now Bangladesh, and we did Indochina, and you took us on a virtual tour of most of that part of the world. But a question from Stuart Burbage earlier. I know the Burmese weren't very friendly towards Indians in Burma at the time. Did this hostility extend to the Chinese as well? Do we know about Burmese-Chinese troubles?
I can't really say that, but I think a couple of my cousins are online here. They actually came from Burma later than we did. They actually came in the 70s when immigration was open. So I can follow up with Stuart and let him know. I can ask them. They would definitely know for sure. Of course, during that time, they chased all the Chinese out in the 70s, took their businesses and chased them out. So, but I don't know about the time back then, but I will ask.
Okay, thank you. Andreas is asking, where can he get the book? Your father's book. You said self-published, but is it still available or is it all gone now?
No, there were 200 copies and they're pretty much all gone. But Andreas, since you're such a good friend, I can send you the PDF copy.
There we are. That's the way to do it. Kind of a more general question there, not just for yourself, perhaps people in the sidebar as well. Karaticus there. I'm wondering if the monumental effort of the Burma Road is even remembered or taught in modern China. So we know it is acknowledged in kind of Western history, but do we happen to know whether or not it's part of Chinese history in 2024?
I don't know necessarily, but I know there is a effort to bring the Chinese and the Americans together over World War II. The owner of the Chenault Museum, I can't remember her name right now, but she has taken World War II veterans to China, and Nell Calloway, and they have tried to bring the story of the Flying Tigers back, bring the stories of the Burma Road back. They are treated, the World War II veterans that go there are treated like rock stars. So maybe there's still some hope at some relationship and some history being told again.
That'd be nice to think that's the case. Phil Blood, the venerable Dr. Phil Blood, have you visited China yourself, Susan?
I have. Once Joe and I went in 2006 on a tour. So that's the extent of it, really. We had always meant to go back to Lobaksan, but we haven't made it back yet.
Yeah, it is the best way to say it. Atomic Peacenik, which is a fantastic screen name. Susan, do you have any other research you'd be willing to share here at another time? Have you published anything else we can read elsewhere? Basically, people are saying, bring her back. She's very good. So have you got a potential second presentation in you in the future, Susan? We won't ask for it next week.
No, but I can think about it. I actually gave a talk about my mom, which overlaps the story quite a bit.
There's an idea. One from Bob M, which will probably be our last one. Fantastic talk. Question: during Susan's research, did she come across anything not in her dad's book which she knew nothing about, and it made her go, "Wow"?
Let me think. In order to do this talk and to keep it to 50 minutes, I had to cut out a lot of stuff. There was, he really, it's a small paperback, but he really packed a lot into it. So what really made me go, "Wow"? I guess where he was traveling, that passage that I read you, where he got bombed in Baosan and where he met the Chinese soldiers, and they had they held a gun to his head. That to me was just wow, most amazing. And he had more life-threatening episodes after being in China too, by the way. So
we heard about Sam, and I think my takeaway from this, Susan, will be the reminder I get every now and then on this channel is that we do kind of put things in boxes and think about the Russian experience, the Belarus experience, the whatever it was experience. But the reality is the population of the globe as it is today was all mixed. People had camps and feet in different areas. And, we shouldn't maybe think of this as being a Chinese story. It is a global story and people were in China at that time, but they were from other places. They emigrated to other places. They had other other influences. I'm going to recommend, folks, separate to Susan's talk, a book I was given as a present last year, Peach Blossom Spring by Melissa Fu, which is a novel, historical fiction, but it's about a Chinese family. And it's a multi-generational book that takes you right up to the present day, and it starts you in China during the war, then goes through all the difficulties that take. It's a fantastic read. One of those stories that I didn't think I was going to necessarily appreciate because it was out of my comfort zone. I'll put the link in later on to the because for those who are interested. So yeah, it's people are saying there's another potential addition, part 2, Susan, in the future. But right now we will bring things to an end. So I know, Susan, there you are. You're a bit nervous about this, but you've well and truly accomplished it. You knocked it out of the park in your first presentation, and I think that's all credit to you and all credit to the people who helped you, like Rick and Norma and all the others. And Rick says, great work on the pronunciation. We joked, Rick, before going live, there's you, a white Canadian, correcting an ethnic Chinese on her pronunciation, and that's the way the world is today, and all the better for it. We're all a big group of mixed people, and that's how it should be. So, folks, I'm back with NCR Davis tomorrow talking about her mother. So we've got 2 family stories back to back for you. Her mother was a nurse in Patton's Third Army. Bruce M. Petty is coming on later in the week. That's in morning for me, evening if you're in Australia or New Zealand, talking about his work into the missing of Saipan. Lots more things coming up. I'm working on a whole lot more shows all through the summer. Thanks as always, viewers, for your questions, your comments. We didn't get to all of them, but we got to most of them. And thank you for making Susan so welcome. And Susan, you were brilliant. Let's do it again sometime.
Thank you, Woody.
Brilliant. So, folks, I'll see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV. Click like and subscribe, and do what you can to spread the word. Cheers, everybody. Bye.